Good morning. Y'all are doing good. Good to see you. Good to be back out. As y'all know with little ones, it's the virus shares its way around the house and picked me to go last. So I thank Clint for covering for me and letting me stay home and rest. I feel much better today and thankful for it. But I do appreciate being able to be back. I want y'all to go ahead and get your Bibles out if you would. Go ahead and go towards the end of Mark chapter 1. So we left off a couple of weeks ago talking about the end of Mark 1 and beginning to go ahead and start considering what's going to take place in chapter 2. But I do want to touch on it because we said we would kind of come back to the very end of chapter 1, at least talk about that, because that's going to apply directly to what we're going to go into as we get into chapter 2. But really looking at verse 40 onward of Mark chapter 1. And so I do want to remind everybody of our main theme going into it, of what exactly we're talking about, of our main question of Mark. We remember we are asking the question and really looking at the idea of who is this man. We're talking about who is Jesus, how do we establish that he is who he says he is, and as we go through Mark chapter 1, we've had so much happen at this point. I think by this point, we said we're at least on our 8th or 9th scene just happening in Mark chapter 1. And actually, no, I lied to you. We're in scene number 11, actually, as we get into Mark chapter 1, verses 40 through 41. So let's go ahead and read verses 40 and 41 together, and then go down and kind of consider what's going on here. It says, "And there came a leper to him, beseeching him, and kneeling down to him, and saying unto him, If thou wilt, thou canst make me clean. And Jesus, moved with compassion, put forth his hand, and touched him, and saith unto him, I will, be thou clean." Now, I want us to stop there. Stop for just a second at the end of verse 41, and let's ask the question, what did leprosy mean as far as if you are a leper in the first century? What kind of life quality of life did you have at that point? Not good. Just about none, wouldn't you? I mean, at this point, so whenever a person is diagnosed with leprosy, and I'll give a little asterisk by this, that the word leprosy at this point, it covers, and we'll see it covering multiple skin disfiguring conditions that people would have. We call it Hansen's disease today as far as the actual idea of leprosy. But whenever you go back and you remember what's taking place in Leviticus chapter 13, and you go back and you read what a leper had to do, Leviticus 13 verses 45 and 46, describes basically the prescription. If you are a person with leprosy, we see that they are going to have to carry out several different things. One of those biggest things was they were to have to cover their upper lip, and what were they to go around town crying? Unclean. And imagine that's your life. You have this covering that you have to have. I have no doubt you look disheveled. You're probably in a tremendous amount of pain. And you have to go around letting everyone know that you're unclean. That sounds like a horrible life, doesn't it? I mean, I can't imagine. So not only that, where were lepers required to live? Are they living next to you? Or no, they're outside of the city, aren't they? They're in basically their own little place where they all gather together. They're cut off from their family. They're cut off from work. They're cut off from worship. And so as you open the scene in verse number 40 and you think about what this man is, we would probably call it like he's socially dead. I mean, this man has no contact with anybody else. Some live next to caves or places where they could beg out of the way. I mean, it's a horrible life. And so you can imagine what he's going through. And I want to give something especially that's going to apply into our lesson later this morning. But the Talmud, which remember is the Jewish writings, this is traditional work, this is not inspired work, regarded leprosy as a divine punishment of God. It is what they regarded leprosy as. And so you would have many Jews regarding, and like I said, that's tradition. That's not God saying that is the case. And the only way back was you had to go and get a priest to basically examine you. You go through an 8-day purification ceremony with animal sacrifices in the temple, and then you could get back. But can you imagine, is leprosy something you think is healed often? No, probably not at all, at least very, very, very infrequently. And so at this point, you don't see this happening. And so a question for you and I, how long do you think it had been since this man had experienced anyone touching him? He doesn't have handshakes. And he's not able to go up and hug his loved ones. I mean, you think about his life at this point. And I want to ask you a question in verse number 41. According to everything we know, did Jesus have to touch this man to heal him?
No.
No. absolutely not. He doesn't. He's not required to. And so what do you think it means that he goes out of his way to put forth his hand? And those two words, I mean, that simple sentence in verse 41 where he goes out of his way and he touches him. I mean, what does that say about the attitude of Christ? I mean, that you see so often Christ being moved with compassion. I mean, can you imagine how long it had been since anybody had shown compassion, since anybody had even touched him? At the end of verse number 41, the question isn't about ability. And you notice he says at the end of verse number 40, and you think about the faith of the leper at this point. What does he say? He doesn't say, if you're able to, as far as if you have the power to. What does he say at the end of verse 40? If you're willing to. If you're willing to do this, and then the end of verse 41, what does Jesus say? I will. I want to shed some light. One more interesting thing as I was studying through this. I can only find two other instances in Scripture that at least come to my head in that through study that I found where leprosy was something that was ever addressed in the way that Christ would address it here. You have Moses with his sister Miriam, and then you have Elisha intervening for Naaman, both of which required and both had to pray to God in order to get rid of that. In this case, as you're reading down through this, the leper knows Jesus can do it by his will alone. He knows he has the power to do it, and so he does it, and then he can do it. And so now the question is, why would you, as a person who doesn't have leprosy, not touch a person that has it? What would happen to you? You would either get the disease or you would be considered unclean. And so the question for Jesus, is Jesus now unclean or is it vice versa? Now we have the leper man cleansed. And so immediate healing takes place. I want you to look at verse 42. It says, and as soon as he had spoken, immediately the leprosy departed from him and he was cleansed. That's not the normal 8-day purification process, is it, that you see? Immediately this takes place. As soon as he had spoken, leprosy departed from him, and he was cleansed. Now, I want you to remember verse 43 and 44, because this is something we've read earlier on in chapter 1 of things taking place there where Jesus is inciting them to not go and really give this message. 43 to 44 says, he straightly charged him and forthwith sent him away, and saith unto him, see thou say nothing to any man, but go thy way, show thyself to the priest, and offer for thy cleansing those things which Moses commanded for a testimony unto them. So, does Jesus go ahead per Levitical law and tell them to do exactly what the Levitical law says? He does. He says, you keep with that custom. What he's talking about takes place in Leviticus 14 and 15. He says, you go with that law that's established. And remember, did Jesus come to destroy the law? Did he come to go outside? No, he came to fulfill it. And so he's in keeping with that law. At the end of verse number 45, what happens? Well, after this man is healed, after Jesus says this, to what he's supposed to go out to do, it says in verse 45, but he went out and began to publish it much and to blaze abroad the matter, insomuch that Jesus could no more openly enter into the city, but was without in desert places, and they came to him from every quarter. Now, at the end of verse number 45, that same word for that idea of publishing it, he's preaching it, he's proclaiming it, he's spreading and sharing the message. And so the question is kind of like, well, how could he hold it in? I mean, how long had he been with this disease of leprosy? I mean, how long had it been since he'd been able to really have communication and really contact with anybody? What else could we do other than proclaim the message? And so the question for you and I, do you believe Jesus is able to question whether or not he's willing? That's a great question for us to consider as you read verse 40 and 41. He is absolutely able, and he is absolutely willing. So any other thoughts through the end of chapter 1? Now, I do want to shed some light here and go through what is taking place. So as you go through and as you go down into what took place in chapter 1, we really see 4 responses take place from chapter 1. And so if we had to describe Mark 1 in one sentence, if we had to summarize, we can say the king has arrived, and he has arrived with authority. And so the proclamation of Mark chapter 1, verse number 1 is carried through, and we see 4 different responses that have taken place as we've gone through chapter 1. We see the first response, which is preparation. Verses 2 and 3, they are clearing the path. They are making that way ready. In verse 15, we are told that they repented, that they had turned around, turned away from wickedness. And then the last two was believing, but not believe in and of itself, but to also follow as well, to come behind Jesus. And so the four responses that we see there, and I want you to kind of latch onto this for a second and remember the way the responses were in chapter 1. Because whenever we get into chapter 2, it's going to be the same Christ, the same message, but a radically different response than what we see take place in chapter 1. And so as you get through that, understand the situation is about to change. And if we were to close Mark chapter 1, we could close it with a question. If everything we read in Mark chapter 1 is true, which we know it to be, and if I establish those things to be true in my life, then what part of my life is still acting like I am the king instead of Christ? He is the king. He is the one that has come with authority. Am I submitting to him, or am I still submitting to self? Am I submitting to my own desires? Am I submitting to the way that I want things to be, to tradition? And that's really where Mark chapter 2 comes into play. Now, a couple of weeks ago, whenever we ended Mark chapter 1, I asked you as you went through Mark chapter 2 to read through it. And one of the things that I wanted you to really focus on was to mark every time someone questioned Jesus' authority. Hopefully you were able to do that in the last couple of weeks. And to come wondering about the question of what do people do when God's rule challenges their tradition, which is something, is that relevant to you and I today? Oh, it absolutely is, isn't it? And so what if God is challenging our tradition? What if he is challenging our tradition with our rule, or with his rule versus what we want to be ruling as? And so if we were to ask the question of marking every time someone questioned Jesus' authority, hopefully by the end of that study, you were able to go and able to find that there are 5 distinct challenges in Mark chapter 2 to the authority of Christ. And the fifth and I'll say there's kind of an asterisk next to the fifth, because the fifth spills into chapter 3, so we'll finish it next week. But there are 5 distinct challenges to the authority of Jesus, and I'll give you those before we get into them. Every time we are reading about these conflict stories taking place in Mark 2, every single one of them deal with the question of whether or not Jesus has the authority to do these things. The first of which comes in chapter 2, verses 1 through 12, whether or not he has the authority to forgive sins. Then we read in verses 13 through 17, does he have authority over who belongs in the kingdom? And then in verses 18 through 22, does he have authority over religious traditions? The fourth one is, does he have authority over the Sabbath? And then the fifth and final is, does he have authority over the law itself? And so I want you to think about how things have escalated to this point. The reason I say that is because in Mark chapter 1, what was the general response of the people? How did they respond to what Jesus did? Was it good or bad? Great. They were amazed. They were in wonder. They were proclaiming the message. In Mark chapter 2, the same people start to plot to kill Jesus. It's the same Jesus. It's the same message. And the difference is whether or not the authority of Jesus questions or maybe threatens our own. Because now his authority is bleeding in and threatening those people in power. So everything we read about, just to give you some perspective, when you open up into verse number 1 of chapter 2, it says, "And again he entered into Capernaum after some days, and it was noised that he was in the house." I want to give you a picture of what this looked like, and these are small, so if you can't read them, I'll give them to you later. But everything taking place in Mark 2 happens near Capernaum. That's the same fishing village that we have already read about, that we already studied through as we went through Mark chapter 1. And I want to give you a picture of what this city looks like. The houses are made of black basalt fieldstone, and what that means is they were basically held together by mud and pebbles. They're held together, and we would call it crude today, but they're not held together by mortar. You know, if you have rock and mortar, it's a very stout structure. These houses were basically held together. They were a mixture of mud and pebbles. And what that meant was, a lot of times the walls, at least in Capernaum, were too weak for a second story. And so these are very small places. These are places that whenever you think about the roof was made with wood and it was covered with reeds. And so whenever you give, and you read verse number 4 of Mark chapter 2 of how he's able to do this, he's not cutting through plywood and mortar whenever he's doing that. The house, he's climbed up there, which is amazing. He's able to even make it up there, is the point. It's a question of whether or not the walls are even going to be able to contain them as they go up in verse number 4. But the way these houses were built, they were basically in clusters. Like if we were to look at this middle section of our pews, the houses would kind of be built around that. They're kind of like in a courtyard. They were a lot of times in 3 to 5 house clusters. And so they're very close together. And they're kind of in this place. And there's some people that look back and they found what they discovered. I'm saying this, if you read about the background of Capernaum, you're going to undoubtedly come across what's called the House of Peter, where archaeologists in the Byzantine area kind of uncovered a very interesting room in one of these houses, which would be the main room. But it was very interesting in that all of the other rooms that they had discovered had normal cooking pots, but above this room they had oil lamps. It was found to be a gathering place. And so they found that, and they found a lot of inscriptions on the wall. And so this could have been the room where we're about to read chapter 2, verses 1 through 12 taking place. But at least giving you the picture of these are not very big places. And I mentioned to you, I believe, last week that the biggest room ever found in Capernaum was a 19 by 21 foot room. That's the biggest room ever discovered. So if you have a 19 by 21 foot room, if you have the fire code at the end of it, it would say max capacity 50 people. Okay, these are not giant places that they're gathering. These are very homely structures. These are structures where they would meet in, where it's very close-knit. And so that's the scene as you open up into chapter 2. And we'll wait to give you a little bit more background behind the tax booth and the Pharisees, because we will get into them a little bit later. But I do want to go ahead and read verse number 2, because that opens it up and it gives us this picture of what's happening. And so here is the first conflict that's going to take place in Mark chapter 2. So in verse number 1 and 2, in verse 1 we read that he is in Capernaum, that they hear about him returning. In verse 2 it says, and straightway many were gathered together, insomuch that there was no room to receive them, no, not so much as about the door, and he preached the word unto them. So he's back in Capernaum, and according to Mark chapter 1 and verse number 38, what is the reason he is there for? What is his purpose? To save. And what does he say his main purpose is? Mark 1 verse 38. To preach. So what is he doing in Mark chapter 2 as we open it up? He's doing what he has come to do. He is preaching. And so the crowd is so large in verse number 2 that there's no room. There's not even room at the door. Like people are waiting, they're trying to get in. And so if you have a room that's 19 by 21 and you have the entire town trying to come to you, and you've got 50 people crammed in there like sardines, the rest of the people trying to get in. I mean, can you imagine what it must have looked like? And so in verse number 3, as this is taking place, and as he is preaching to this crowd that's just overwhelming this small place, it says in verse 3, and they come unto him, bringing one sick of the palsy, which was born of 4. And when they could not come nigh unto him for the press, they uncovered the roof where he was, and when they had broken it up, they let down the bed wherein the sick of the palsy lay. So stop at the end of verse number 4. Can you imagine for a second the dedication these men have to do what they just did in verses 3 and 4. So it says they're coming to him. They have one man there that's paralyzed. He's sick of the palsy. It says he's born of the 4. He's carried along by his 4 friends. And in verse number 4, what is the problem they come into? They can't get in the house, right? They can't get in. They're pressed so hard. The people are there. And so looking at this situation, how desperate were they to get their friends to Jesus? Very. What do? They go up, and can you picture it for a second? So they go to the place where Jesus is. And I don't think it's going to, if somebody is cutting through one of our roofs, are you going to notice it? You probably are going to notice it, right? I mean, of course, with ours metal and shingles, you're probably going to notice it. So they're tearing through. They're digging through mud that has the reeds covering it up. You think dirt's falling on anybody? You think, what's happening? You know, if you're there in the room, this is not a peaceful biblical scene. It's probably chaos at this point. How bad did they want to get their friend to Jesus? They were going to do whatever it took. How bad do we want to get our friends? They said, it doesn't matter what's in our way. We're going to get them there. And so in verse number 4, at the end of verse number 4, they break through the roof. They get them down there. They lay them in bed. And in verse number 5, it says, when Jesus saw their faith. And I want to stop for a second. Whose faith did he see in verse 5? 4 friends. And he says he sees their faith. Now there is faith on the part of one of the palsy of the paralytic as well. I mean, obviously, do you think he could have made their life more difficult if he had said, no, I'm not going on a roof? I mean, he had to have enough faith that they're not going to drop him. I mean, if you're trying to lower somebody down through a roof, that's not a peaceful scene. He's got to have enough faith in them to do it. But somebody else's faith caused somebody else to benefit. And so the roof now is opened up, and he's laying down there in verse 5. It says, when Jesus saw their faith, he said unto the sick of the palsy, son, thy sins be forgiven thee. So, whenever you read that, what did they come to Jesus for, you think? Healing. And what did Jesus give to paralytic instead? To not only the paralytic, but can you imagine the friends as well? What did he offer them? He offered them healing, but not healing of the body at this point, was it? Healing spiritually. He says, thy sins be forgiven thee. And so as you read this, the man probably wanted his legs, didn't he? He probably thought, and he knows that Jesus can heal him. What's the more important thing, though? Is forgiveness of sin? That's right, his soul. His soul is the most important thing that they brought in front of him. His soul was what mattered so much. And so they bring him in, and we see that Jesus can absolutely take care of sins. And that's the point. All other problems are secondary to the problem of sin. The soul is what matters, and that's what Jesus saw as he's going down and sees this taking place in verse number 5. And I want to say that because in Jewish theology, in the way that they would talk in the Talmud, and even Job's friends, as you read through Job, really through chapter 3 onward, as they're dealing with that, they saw illness, they saw disease as this form of divine punishment. And as Jesus is going through this, is that really the case? Because what did he heal first? He didn't say, well, I'll heal you so that your sins may be forgiven, did he? He didn't say, well, you have to be healed, you have to not be a paralytic in order to be forgiven. What did he do? Well, he healed sin first. He forgave sin first. He's not concerned about his legs. And so that destroys this idea that illness or sickness or problems that we have is some sort of divine punishment of God. And that destroys the Jewish way of thinking at this point, and probably destroys the way we think as well sometimes. And so as you're going down through this, and in verse number 6, I want you to think back to the reaction, because now we see a problem taking place. Here's the problem taking place, verses 6 and 7. But there were certain of the scribes sitting there, and reasoning in their hearts, why doth this man thus speak blasphemies? Who can forgive sins but God only? Now, that's a good question, isn't it? Did they answer their own question? They answered their own question. They don't like the answer to their question yet, but nevertheless, they answered the question. And so not everybody in the crowd is a fan of Christ, are they? They're not a supporter of his. In fact, there are some sitting back there, and they're talking amongst themselves, and their objection is, well, who can forgive sins other than God? Their objection is right. What do they not recognize, though? Well, who is Jesus? Jesus is God. He has authority. He has the ability to do this. And so Jesus does it without the temple apparatus. He does it without the priestly duty. He does it without any interference from man. He's able to do it on his own. And so Jesus reads their minds. And he reads and he knows what they're thinking. Now, at this point, he's not talking about like he reads their faces and he thinks he knows. No, he's reading and he knows exactly what they're saying in their hearts. And here's what it said in verse 8 and following. It says, and immediately when Jesus perceived in his spirit that they so reasoned within themselves, he said unto them, why reason ye these things in your hearts? Whether is it easier to say to the sick of the palsy, thy sins be forgiven thee, or to say, arise and take up thy bed and walk? But that ye may know that the Son of Man hath power on earth to forgive sins, he saith to the sick of the palsy, I say unto thee, arise and take up thy bed and go thy way into thine house. And immediately he rose, took up the bed, and went forth before them all, insomuch that they were all amazed and glorified God, saying, we never saw it on this fashion. So at the end of verse number 12, what are they thinking? Where does it say they were thinking these things at? According to verse number 8.
They weren't expressing it outwardly, that they were just debating inside among themselves.
So silently among them, he's not overhearing a conversation that they're having. They're debating it internally within themselves, and he asks the question that they're wondering, they're thinking about. And he's asking them directly because they have a problem with it. And so here is the question in verse number 9. Here's the thought here. Which one is easier? Is it easier just that anybody say, well, your sins are forgiven you? Or is it easier to demonstrate that I can heal this one with palsy? Well, the reality to that question is, who can verify whether or not what Jesus says is true? That's one of the things we're wondering. Well, who can verify if somebody has forgiven sin? Because I can say somebody's sins are forgiven, and their point is, well, I mean, who can say that? And so Jesus says, I'm not only just going to say that, I'm going to prove it to you, that what I'm saying has power, has authority, has weight. And so what he does is he goes and he demonstrates visible power. They're not looking at this and wonder anymore. They're saying, oh, this man can obviously heal. And so in verse number 10, what does he do to prove that he can forgive sins, that he has that authority?
Physically heals.
Physically heals. And the question behind this is, why did Jesus do that? Obviously, he's got compassion on him. Obviously, he's got compassion on the friends. But what was the purpose behind the healing according to verse number 10?
Use something they could see to prove something they couldn't see.
That's exactly right. To see something physical, to demonstrate to them beyond a shadow of doubt that Christ has all authority. And so in verse number 11, that's exactly what takes place. It says in verse 12, he arose. And by the way, how fast did he arose or get up? Immediately he gets up. He takes up the bed, went forth before them all. And it says at the end of verse number 12, insomuch that they were all amazed and glorified God, saying, we never saw it on this fashion. He's not doing it the old way. He said, we've never seen anything like this. He is different than anything we've ever seen, anything we could have ever imagined. And so at this point, they were all amazed and glorified God. But unfortunately, you think we're still going to have problems? We are. We are still going to have problems, and this conflict is not over. Now, any other thoughts through the end of verse number 12? Now, I want to give you, before we quit, there's one other thing I want to give you, and that is some thought behind some fulfillment that's taking place here. So I want you to keep your finger there in Mark chapter 2, really verse number 10, and then go back to the Old Testament for a second with me to Daniel chapter 7. And I want you to look at verses 13 and 14 with me. Daniel chapter 7, in verses 13 and 14. And I have got a question for us as we close and as we kind of finish up this topic. And that is, why exactly does he say the Son of Man? You know, we see this phrase used. We know that Jesus uses it quite often. In verse number 10, we see him use it. And I want you to look in verse number 13 and 14 of Daniel chapter 7. And I want to give you some insight here. So as you turn over there, Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 and 14 says, I saw in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man came with the clouds of heaven and came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. And there was given him dominion and glory and a kingdom that all people, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed, through verse 14. Now the word given over there, the Septuagint translation, which remember is the Greek writing of the Old Testament, the word dominion there in verse number 14 is that word that is authority, which is a direct shot. It's a direct contradiction to what the scribes were thinking in their mind. And so to prove he has authority, according to Mark chapter 2, what exactly does he do? Well, he's got to prove he is the fulfillment of Daniel chapter 7. He is the one they've been waiting on. He is the Son of Man. He is the one with all dominion, all power, and everlasting kingdom. And so to prove he has authority by the time he comes on earth, in Mark chapter 10, what does he do? Well, he heals the paralytic. And whenever he heals the paralytic, the man doesn't get up as slow. And by the way, don't you think whenever he's leaving there, in verse number 12, what does it say he took with him? He kind of takes everything he's been carried with and he takes it out with him. Is that a man that's recovering from a long-term illness and he's got to take weeks and months and years to get better? No, immediately he's healed. And so is Jesus the same man spoken of in Daniel chapter 7? That's the question for us. Is he the one that has been prophesied to come? Is he truly the Son of Man? Well, according to Mark chapter 2, verse 10, he is that man. And then there it is again in verse number 12 as you read Mark chapter 2. They were all amazed. And remember, that's that word used. You and I say we're amazed about a lot of things. They're beyond understanding. They're beyond comprehension. They're beyond what they can fathom. And it says all of them. So who's in that crowd that we know about that's not necessarily too happy? Well, the scribes are there. We know the scribes have already internally had a problem with Christ, and they are amazed, but maybe theirs is closer to fear than necessarily amazement. They can't describe what has happened and what's going on here. So as we see this taking place, Jesus is going down, he's going out of his way to prove, look, he's not some random individual. He's not just stating these things. He is the one that has been prophesied the entire time. You know how long Jesus has been prophesied in Scripture? Go back to Genesis 3, and you see there that golden thread. This is not a random man. This is not just a prophet. This is not just one great man of God. This is the Son of Man that's come. And what does the Son of Man have power to do? He has authority over all. He has the power to forgive sins. He has the power and the ability to establish his dominion forever and ever. That's who this man Jesus is. All right, any other thoughts before we close this morning? All right, appreciate you, friends. By the way, Daniel says twice the Son of Man reference. The reference here, we're talking about the use of Daniel. Ezekiel refers to the Son of Man 93 times. And so this is not a random occurrence or a one-time occurrence. This is something that's been prophesied. All right, so let's stop here at the end of verse number 12 of Mark chapter 2 today. And if you get a chance, study through those last 4 conflicts we were talking about. There's 4 more conflicts that take place. And remember to write that down. Just jot down anytime the authority of Jesus is questioned, what they're questioning him for, what's going on. And then next week we'll sit down and have a conversation about it. All right, appreciate y'all very much. We'll close for the morning, take a break, and then begin our worship here in just a little bit.